Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited and our Twin Charged Magnum project. Now in this episode, we are going to continue with our engine long block assembly, get that base all ready for our project, and importantly, we're going to cover how to adapt a set of Eagle cylinder heads onto your pre-Eagle Hemi block. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Let's get into it. So this next part is going to be fun because it's something I've never done before, and that is filing the piston rings to open up that ring gap to give ourselves a little bit of a safety margin when we add forced induction to this engine. Now, from what I've read online, seems like the ideal gap for an upper ring for a forced induction application is 25 thousandths. Now, the factory ring gap on these engines has a maximum of 19 thousandths, so I don't think we're going to have to open up the rings all that much to match that. And what we're going to do is we're going to use 25 thousandths for both the top ring and the secondary ring as well. The process that works best for me in these situations is to be as organized as I possibly can. Lay things out orderly, make sure it's nice and clean and neat, label things if necessary. That way, as you're going together, it's almost like an assembly line and everything goes smoothly. For this iteration of the build, we are just going to be reinstalling the factory camshaft. Now, I know you guys are thinking, what are you thinking? This is the perfect time to install an upgraded camshaft. Certainly no arguing that, but again, this is the guinea pig engine. I just want to get this thing together and make sure that it's going to work with the system that I create for it. And I'm sure you guys can tell that it's not exactly a difficult task for me to be able to swap a camshaft later on. So I'm not concerned about it. We're just going to slap that stock camshaft back in here. Like I said, we are upgrading to a new set of lifters, non-MDS lifters. We're going to put those MDS block off plugs here in the top of the block. We're also going to install a new timing chain and set on the front of this thing just to make sure that that's nice and solid as well. So let's get into all of that. We've got our full bottom end rotating assembly all in. Everything's torqued down. We've got our oil pan on there. One thing we're going to do before we do anything else as far as the cylinder heads or head gaskets, anything like that, we want to go ahead and spin the engine over, make sure there's no tight spots, make sure everything is rotating freely and smoothly like it should. All right, everything looks great. We can move on to our next step. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing an Eagle cylinder head swap on this engine. Now, what does that mean? Well, prior to 2009, the Hemi engine had these older cylinder head castings, and although they weren't that bad, on the 2009 and later Hemi engines, they upgraded to this Eagle style cylinder head. Now, what makes it better? Well, it flows significantly more than this cylinder does. Now, how much more? Well, just a few days ago, I probably couldn't have told you the exact numbers. However, one of my favorite shows on Motor Trend called Engine Masters, they did a direct comparison back to back, and they said that these older style cylinder heads flow 260 CFM, or cubic feet per minute, and the newer ones flow 330. That's a 22% increase just with this different casting. So that tells you that this is absolutely a worthwhile mod to go ahead and upgrade your pre-Eagle engine with these Eagle cylinder heads. Now, at a quick glance, it's easy to say that these two cylinder heads look identical, but that is not the case at all. Once you start looking a little bit closer, you start noticing all the little differences with them. I'm going to show you exactly what's required to go ahead and upgrade to these newer style cylinder heads. Now, one of the first things you'll notice when you take a closer look at these cylinder heads is the combustion chamber design. Now, you'll notice with these older ones that it has more of a round design here, and it's actually sunken in a little bit, whereas on the newer Eagle style, it's completely flush and you have more of an oval shaped combustion chamber. Now, when you do that, you actually raise your compression ratio almost a full point. Now, these older engines here, you're running at 9.6 to 1 compression ratio. On the newer Eagle cylinder heads, you're running 10.5 to 1. Now, the next thing I like to key in on here is the exhaust port design. Now, you notice it is a very dramatic difference between the older style exhaust ports and the newer style, just how much larger these newer style exhaust ports are. Now, a point to note here is that the exhaust flange pattern, the bolt pattern, is exactly the same between the two. So your existing exhaust will bolt directly to these newer Eagle cylinder heads. Now, if anything, the differences on the intake ports are even more dramatic than on the exhaust ports, the differences between the two. Now, if you notice on the older cylinder head here, that the ports are more rectangular shaped, whereas on the newer cylinder head, they are more square shaped. And I'd like to point out here that even though the bolt pattern is identical on the intake side as well, you cannot use your original intake manifold on this engine. The shape of the ports is different enough that your intake manifold will not actually seal properly around all the edges of the ports. So you cannot use your original intake manifold. Now, there's also another reason why you can't use your stock intake manifold. We're going to get into that right now. Now, I'd like to draw your attention on this pre-Eagle cylinder head right here. This is the exhaust flange on the passenger side of the engine. Now, you'll notice that there's an extra hole right here. Now, what is that hole for? Well, that is for your EGR, or your exhaust gas recirculation. This passageway is drilled through the cylinder head, comes out the front here, and that's where your EGR valve directly bolts to. If you'll notice on the Eagle cylinder head that it does not have any such provision, and that is because the Eagle engines do not use EGR. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's a good thing, right? Because I don't really want to have that EGR system on my car anyway. Well, yes and no. I would say it's good that you don't have the EGR system. You don't have to deal with that. However, if you think about it, that EGR tube that comes off of your EGR valve, that tube goes directly into your stock intake manifold. Now, if you don't have that tube on there, you're going to have a gaping hole in your intake manifold, and there's no easy way to block that off. Now, of course, you could still bolt the EGR valve and have that tube in place even with these newer style cylinder heads. But again, you can't actually use that stock intake manifold anyway because the intake ports don't line up. So the whole entire point is moot anyway. Now, when you're thinking about the overall physical dimensions of these cylinder heads, they are very much the same. So if you think about the valve cover, the height of that, where that attaches to, that's identical between the two. The overall height of the cylinder heads themselves, that is identical. So it shouldn't be any problem with swapping them over. But that would lead you to ask, what sort of hard parts do I need to make this swap? Well, the very first thing that I would say is I would go ahead and use the head gasket for the 09 and up Hemi engine. There's very, very minor differences, but I think it's a better match to this newer style cylinder head, so use those head gaskets. Also, you're going to have to use the 09 and up rocker arm assemblies. Physically, I cannot verify that there is technically a difference in size between the two, but that's one of those things that it could be so minuscule that I'm just not catching it. So it only makes sense to go ahead and go with the newer style rocker arm assemblies on there and just leave your old ones be. Now, the big change here that you can see overall is that the spring height is very much taller on the newer style Eagle cylinder heads. The valves are a little bit longer, and I think what this allows them to do is have a little bit more lift on the camshaft where they can open these things a little bit further before they go into coil bind here. Now, these stock ones here from the pre-2009, they're very stubby looking, and I think you could only open them so far before those valve springs will start to bind up on you. So the newer ones, they have a little bit more travel, a little bit more range. What that means is that you have to have longer push rods to go in the newer style Eagle cylinder heads. So honestly, the list is fairly short as far as hard parts that you're going to need to change. You're going to need, obviously, the Eagle cylinder heads. You will need the cylinder head gaskets for the 09 and up Hemi engines. You're going to need the push rods for this newer style engine, the rocker arms, and also a newer style intake manifold. All right, a couple more quick tips as far as installing these Eagle cylinder heads on your pre-Eagle engine. You're going to have to purchase a tuner so you can turn that EGR system off entirely. If you do not, you'll have that check engine light on all the time. Secondly, the new intake manifold, the 09 and up intake manifold, takes a different type of map sensor. So you will, one, have to have that newer type of map sensor, but you'll also have to change the electrical connector to that map sensor. So if you're not comfortable with wiring, you're going to have somebody do that for you, but it's very simple, just 3 wires, cut and solder the new plug on there. And also too, you will have to have the newer style fuel rails on there with the newer style intake manifold because your old style fuel rail will not fit on the newer intake manifold either. Now, something that's nice is that your original valve covers will fit on these newer style cylinder heads. I have already done it. In fact, this 6.4 engine that I'm running in Identity Crisis, my C10 with the 392 in there, those valve covers are actually from an 06 Ram 1500. In fact, they're from this original engine right here. I went ahead and swapped them onto a 6.4 and they fit absolutely perfect with no issues at all. Another thing that's kind of nice for this swap is that it does not matter if you reuse your stock cylinder head bolts, because the cylinder head bolts are identical between the older style cylinder head and the newer style. And one last point to note on this swap is that the piston design between the older engine and the newer engine is identical, so you don't have to worry about any sort of interference issues with that. Now remember, if you are doing this Eagle cylinder head swap, the whole point of it is to add additional airflow. You have to give them the capability to do that. What I mean by that is, if you are not also doing an upgrade of your camshaft to a more aggressive camshaft, you're really limiting the potential of what these things can do. One more point about this Eagle cylinder head swap is that it is only applicable to 2003 to 2008 5.7 liter Hemi. 09 and up already have the Eagle cylinder heads, and I believe, from what I understand, the 6.1 liter Hemis also already have the Eagle heads on them. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get these Eagle cylinder heads bolted down to this pre-Eagle block. Now, I'm not gonna go into detail on this because it's the exact same assembly process as I've shown multiple times on my channel. If you have any questions about installing cylinder heads on your Hemi engine, please check out my engine reassembly playlist that I have on my channel. You'll find a number of videos there, and at least one of those should cover your questions. So I'm trying not to repeat myself too much building up this particular engine. However, this point I think is important enough to go over again. And that is, once you have all your push rods in place, your rocker arms, all of that, before you go putting your valve covers on, you'll want to spin the engine over by hand to make sure everything moves smoothly and to make sure that all of your push rods are seated. By far, #1 issue I see when people work on a Hemi engine is when they get this back together again, they've got a push rod out of place or it's not quite seated correctly, and that causes a misfire. They got to take it back apart and fix that. So before you put those valve covers on, go ahead and spin the engine over at least 3 or 4 cycles. Check to make sure that each and every one of your valves is actuating correctly, and also check to make sure that there's no interference between your valves and your pistons, like you have your timing incorrect. If you do it by hand and it goes clunk clunk and runs into the piston, then you know your timing's off and you'll have to fix it right then before you go and just crank your engine over and bend a bunch of valves and cause yourself a lot more headaches. So huge step. Once you've got these rocker arms back on, spin this engine over by hand, make sure everything spins smoothly before you continue with your engine assembly. And of course, right when I mentioned that, I did exactly that. Over here on piston number 7, I believe this is, I got this intake push rod not fully seated, even though this is what I do all the time. I did it too, so don't be embarrassed if that is a mistake that you make, but check it beforehand, before you reassemble everything. It'll save you so much time and energy of having to redo it later on. So check, triple check that everything is correct. I gotta get that push rod back in place. We'll keep going. All right, we look good. We're ready to move on to our next step. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for this episode of our Twin Charged Magnum. Now, for me personally, the engine reassembly stuff isn't all that exciting, so I'm trying to move through that as quickly as we can so we can get to the fabrication side, which is what I really enjoy the most. Hope you guys are enjoying this series so far. We'll see you next time on Reignited.